Assalamu alaikum, everybody. It's a great honor to be part of this session, Jashn Iqbal, and my thanks to London Urdu Voice, the organization that is sponsoring this major event, and approached me to share my thoughts on Allama Iqbal, his philosophical contributions with you. And especially my thanks to Akram Qaim Khani Sahab and to Yusuf Ibrahim Sahab for facilitating my participation in this August activity. I would talk about modernity, which I think in Urdu, Farsi, Arabic, Turkish, Uzbek is called Jadidiyat. And I know it's not the proper translation, but we know what does it mean generally. And I think it's more than revival, it is more than rebirth. I think the English word renaissance, or in Arabic and Urdu, we call it Tahrik-e Ahyai Ulum. But anyway, we'll come back to it. And I also want to talk about Allama Iqbal in reference to his philosophical ideas and how he played such a pioneering role as a bridgehead between Eastern Islamic philosophy and Islamic or Muslim literature, and what some scholars call the Persianate, and now more recently Islamicate, and the West. And the West would largely mean Europe at that stage. And he used his poetry, and Allama Iqbal used platforms by giving lectures, and those lectures have been published, over the years. First time they were published in 1932, then 1934, and more recently, publication has been undertaken by Stanford University, the reconstruction of Islamic thought. And I would invite you to read those lectures. They are gems, and sometimes I wonder whether Iqbal should have spent more time on philosophical issues and writing about them. But Iqbal is a great poet, and not just a great poet of Urdu, of course, preeminent poet of Urdu in the 20th century, but also of Farsi. And more like a classicist like Mirza Ghalib of the 19th century Delhi, Allama Iqbal is one of the greatest poets of Farsi. And you get to know Iqbal when you go to Iran, or you go to Uzbekistan, or Tajikistan, or Afghanistan, or places where some of these diaspora communities live from those countries and who speak Farsi. In Uzbekistan, it is called Tajiki. But Iqbal is somebody who is very well known to literary groups, and especially those people who are aware of these wonderful traditions of Persian language and Persian literature. Most of his poetry, like Mirza Ghalib, is in Farsi. And I'm worried that many of our people in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh do not understand Farsi or can't read Farsi. But there are good translations of Allama Iqbal by a very famous leftist historian, Professor Victor Kiernan, who taught in Lahore at FC College in the 1930s and 1940s before coming back and teaching in Edinburgh. He passed away after a very long life. He is the man who also translated Faiz Ahmad Faiz. So Iqbal's personality as a poet, as a philosopher, and as a politician is quite unprecedented. And it's not an exaggeration to call Iqbal the greatest Muslim philosopher of the 20th century. So Maulana Rum's tomb, that is where, I would remember Muhammad Iqbal, because Muhammad Iqbal called Rumi as Ustad, as a teacher, as the real tutor. And one of his verses, he says, Masnavi-e Maulavi-e Manavi hast Quran dar zubane Pahlavi. So this 20th century graduate from Cambridge and from Munich and Heidelberg considers this medieval poet Sufi as his teacher. So let's go back to modernity, and then come back to Iqbal and see how they are connected and what Iqbal is trying to suggest. And we could always differ with Iqbal, but I think the reflections that he shared with us and the level of his immersion in Western philosophy and also in this Persianate or Islamic philosophy or Muslim philosophy is amazing. So Iqbal's debates with Sufis, with scholars, with poets of the East and the West, make him into a unique person. And this was a great writer and intellectual and philosopher in Iran, Ali Shariati, who considered Iqbal to be somebody like Insani Kamil, who himself had attained that status. Not, of course, equal to the Prophet, but in the traditions of the Prophet that Muhyiddin ibn Arabi and several other scholars during the medieval period, which we call the golden period of Islamic learning and thought, had talked about. Now, so remember some of these points when we move ahead. I know that in the Muslim world, there are people who feel that modernity is a Western/European and now Euro-American project. And it is very much against the grains or the spirit or the rule of Islam or Eastern civilization or Eastern traditions. And largely, I think this hesitation, or something which becomes denigration of the West or denigration of modernity or Jadidiyya, is because of uneven relationship that Europe had and maybe continues to have with the non-European world. There have been movements in recent times to decolonize, Eurocentric scholarship. But European primacy through their empires, and also through the scholarship and languages and contribution and industry and financial institutions. Some people may call it cultural imperialism, economic imperialism, and racism was part of it. All these things, as a huge package, created resentment and hesitation amongst many non-Europeans, especially from the late 19th century and during the late 18th century and the 19th century. So anyway, so Europe's dominance in all these different areas, not just through colonialism, created serious questions. And this is where this debate about modernity came along. So many scholars, many intellectuals, traditional ashraf, people linked with Sufi traditions, and especially with madrasa traditions, they felt that this modernity was going to cause uprootedness, and it will teach us a kind of self-abnegation, self-rejection, and we'll lose our roots, and we'll become copycats. And our cultures, languages, religions, traditions that we have inherited from our ancestors, including this idea of Islamic golden period during the medieval period, will be compromised. So other than resistance against the political dominance of European powers, many of these ashraf, Muslim elite, political and intellectual and religious, felt that they should resist the acceptance of those ideas and those institutions and the languages and the heritage and the new, innovations which were coming in the wake of European domination of the non-European world. So one attitude was dismiss it, ignore it, go back to your roots, become more puritanical. And this is where late 18th century, you see the Wahhabi movement. In early 19th century in India, we see the descendants of Shah Waliullah in Delhi, in Lucknow, raising the flag of dissent. And eventually, one part of that tradition becomes Tehreek-e-Jihad. But then 1857 in the subcontinent shook us up. Despite being a majority, despite, lots of enthusiasm, Indians and Muslims are a major portion of those rebels. They failed. They were subdued. And already, Bengal and Mysore and Awadh and Punjab and Sindh and all these places have been subjugated. And similar story in the Balkans, across the Ottoman Empire, and in Central Asia and the Caucasus, Crimea, and later on Persia and the Middle East. So one response to these challenges of Jadidiyya, intellectual, cultural, religious, was rejection. But then after 1857, some people thought in India, in the Ottoman Empire, and in Egypt, that the way forward, and also in Central Asia, that the way forward is that we become accommodative and become part of this modernity and become beneficiaries of this modernity through education, through more scientific approach, logical approach to our religion, to our beliefs, to our practices, and perhaps become economically, financially more stable. And eventually, with this empowerment, we could challenge colonialism. So this was the approach of what we call those people who believe in accepting modernity and accepting those ideas which came along. And modernity was based on reason, on analysis, on greater awareness of scientific approach to understanding human and natural phenomena. That is what modernity was and is all about. In more recent years, people talk of democracy, freedom of expression, women's rights, acceptance for pluralism. Some people talk of secularism. So this project of modernity has been growing, has becoming, over the years, has become more complex. And let me suggest now, it's no more dominated by the Western thoughts, though maybe its roots were in the West, in a triumphant Europe. But when you look at Japan today, and you look at South Korea today, or you look at China today, in Southeast Asia, modernity has found new homes, and it has been very successful. But these are the questions which people like Muhammad Iqbal confronted. Sir Syed was the pioneer modernist. His view was that Muslims have been left behind because they haven't moved along with the changing needs of the time. And he thought it was through education, through literary skills, and through analytical approach to our religious beliefs and practices, we'll be able to make a new beginning. And this is the tradition which I think we owe to Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, and eventually, his scientific society, his emphasis for a simple, language that people could understand, a kind of Urdu which is easily understood and shared by everybody, unlike the Urdu of Lucknow and Delhi in the previous years, which was very literary and very complex and very compound. Also, the Aligarh School that he established, which later on, after his death in 1920, became the university, the first modern Muslim university. And he faced resistance, but he was an untiring man. And he went around all over the subcontinent, seeking help from Muslim families, Muslim ashraf, and eventually he established Aligarh. Not only that, he did lots of translation work. In London, in Bloomsbury, if you happen to go around near Russell Square, you will see there are a couple of houses where Sir Syed lived. In 1866, 1868, he borrowed money, he came from India, he lived there, he would go to the British Museum Library reading room, which was the main reading room in London, and he did his study, and then he wrote this massive book on the life of the Holy Prophet, which was published in France and translated into many languages. And he challenged the missionaries, and he challenged the Orientalists, who were kind of unabashed, critics of Islam, Hinduism, Eastern religions, knowledge, and they thought that these traditions are not taking these people anywhere unless they become the followers of European kind of modernity. And this is where colonialism was presented as a benevolent project. Jamaluddin Afghani also believed in changing the fate of the Muslims. But his approach was that we resist modernity and we don't follow the Western traditions and we don't establish those institutions in a way that we end up producing what Macaulay in 1835 had called the brown Englishman. So his defiance, his resistance sometimes became very personal in his criticism of Sir Syed Ahmad Khan. But both these personalities are towering 19th century thinker and activist. And then we see Jamaluddin Afghani in Egypt, and he influences Muhammad Abduh. We see him in Ottoman Turkey. He has debates with the Caliph. And then we find him in France, and he is having debates and discussions with the French scholars like Ernest Renan, and he's publishing Urwatul Wuska. And he was basically an Iranian, and he presented himself in India as a Sunni Afghani scholar. But anyway, these are the two towering personalities. And then we see another generation which benefits from this approach, that we don't resist, we don't defy the challenges and the opportunities provided by this modernity, this jadidiyya, rationalism, modern knowledge, modern philosophy, a new, fresh, regenerative approach to our religion and to our lifestyle. So this jadidiyya, this package, was picked up by people like Sayyid Amir Ali. Not much work has been done on Sayyid Amir Ali. He's buried here at the Woking Cemetery, like many other 19th and early 20th century Muslim scholars. And this Woking Mosque, was established with the money from Nawab of Bhopal. So it's called Shah Jahan Masjid, first masjid in this part of the world. Sayyid Amir Ali wrote so much. He is the first Muslim to write 2 regular history books in English, The Spirit of Islam and A History of the Saracens. And I come across his articles in the Times, his letters to the MPs. And earlier, he had played a very important role in Bengal as a jurist, as a professor of law. And then later on, he migrated to Britain. And he was a scholar, an activist scholar, until his death in 1926 or 1927. He was the founder of Muslim League in London. So I'm sure he influenced people like Muhammad Iqbal. Then we had people like Sir Abdul Qadir, who came from Punjab, who was studying here at Cambridge. Then we had Sir Fazl Hussain. Not many people know about Sir Fazl Hussain. He was, I think, born in Sialkot like Allama Iqbal and came here to study, traveled, wrote his diary, went back, and he became a politician and law. Most of these people were studying law, by the way. And he was the founder of Unionist Party, and he encouraged Muslim families of Punjab to send their kids to schools and colleges, like government colleges. Yes, actually, he became education minister of Punjab in the 1920s, and he created special, seats for Muslim students at the Punjab University and Government College Lahore. So this is the generation that Allama Iqbal belonged to, and this is the generation which is imbued with those ideas. They're very much rooted in their own religion and their own traditions. They introduce themselves as Muslims, Mohammedans, Hindustani, but they want to move ahead. And this is where Muhammad Iqbal, as a very sensitive student, studies philosophy. So his knowledge of Persian literature, Persian language, Arabic, and his study of philosophy and law, I think he gains that kind of foundation. He was already writing Urdu poems, and there was this organization in Lahore which used to organize mushairas, and it used to organize sessions, and it established schools and colleges in Lahore, and Iqbal used to read his poetry. So he was already a public figure. But coming here and studying philosophy, I think that is where Iqbal was not only just a student of Jadidiyat or modern Europe or modern West and Western philosophy, he was seeing this very much, these philosophical thoughts being debated, discussed in academic circles and philosophical circles in Europe. So I think when we look at Iqbal's philosophy, he's trying to establish the position of Islam within modern philosophy. Because generally the view is that philosophy is a very deconstructionist kind of paradigm. It creates skepticism. It raises questions. And it's not very fond of religion. It does not take beliefs and ideas in a very uncritiqued way. It raises issues. And that is why between religion and philosophy there has been a tension from day one. Whether you look at Aristotle, you look at Plato, or Plotinus, who was the founder of New Platonism, 300 BC in Egypt, because after Greece, Alexandria became the center of philosophy in Egypt. And from Alexandria, then Damascus and cities around Damascus in Syria became the centers of philosophy. And that is why you see people like Al-Farabi, one of the earliest Muslim philosophers who was born in Kazakhstan, present-day Kazakhstan. Farab goes to Syria and then works in Baghdad in Batul Hikmat, which was established by Caliph Mamun. And you see Al-Biruni going to India with Mahmud Ghaznavi. And I visited his town, and I visited the place where Al-Biruni and Ibn Sina, who were class fellows and very close friends, where they studied in Bukhara, in the Ark, in the library. And they used to compete with each other. And Al-Biruni said, the same way, Avicenna said that they could not understand Greek philosophy, and they could not understand many other philosophical questions until they read Farabi. So Farabi was a great teacher, was the second teacher after Aristotle in world philosophy. So you see how these people from Central Asia, from North Africa, they come into Syria, they come into present-day Iraq, and this is where the intellectual debates happen. And this is where then Arabic and later on Persian become, the medium of all this scholarly work. And Persian also becomes the medium of Sufi or mystical traditions and poetry. And this is where you get Mullah Rumi, and Bayezid Bistami, and Shams Tabriz, and Fariduddin Attar writing in Farsi. And this is the golden period of Islam, but this is also the golden period of Persian literature. So Iqbal doesn't want to walk away from all this heritage of Khwarizmi, of Ibn Sina, Al-Biruni, Ibn Rushd from Spain, the founder of rationalism. But he's also divided between what we call the Mu'tazila tradition, the rational tradition of Islam, which sadly was suppressed in early Abbasid period, and the tradition of the conformists of Ghazali. He doesn't walk away from Ghazali, but he's trying to find some kind of meeting ground between Imam Ghazali and Ibn Rushd. Imam Ghazali is a conformist. He's an Ash'ari. He was a philosopher. But then he turned towards Sufism and he thought that Islam was complete. Maybe we don't need to raise those philosophical issues. We got to move on. And some people think this is where tahqiq, tanqeed, research, inquiry, investigation stopped. I don't think so. And I don't think we can just blame, these people for stopping philosophical questioning and tradition. But this is where Iqbal is kind of debating through his poetry and through his lectures. So on the one hand, he is like a Sufi, and he is inspired by Sufis, by Ibn Arabi, by Rumi, and Attar, and the other greats, Sadi. But at the same time, I think he's influenced by rationalists, by Mu'tazilas, something which Europe was highlighting after the French Revolution. Kant, Hegel, Nietzsche, and then, of course, the great teacher, Goethe. And he thought that maybe Mu'tazila tradition and, some of these traditions of Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd could be revived by going back to the European, contributions based on rationalism, the rational philosophy, which at the end of the day is still made human being as the center, as the focus of entire human, existence of this universe. And human reason becomes the ultimate guide, according to the rationalists. And this is what, Ibn Rushd, before anybody else, had advocated. So Iqbal is carrying on the tradition of mystics, and he's very much influenced by the rationalists, the European rationalists and the Muslim rationalists. And then he is also influenced by Ghazali, the conformists, the Ash'aris. I think these are the 3 or 4 mainstreams of Iqbal's thoughts. But like other Muslims, like the generation of Sayyid Ahmad Khan and Sayyid Amir Ali and Fazl Hussain and Sir Abdul Latif in Bengal and others, Iqbal thought we got to move forward. And his own education and exposure to the Western scholarship and institutions had benefited him. So that is where, in those 7 lectures, if you read them, Iqbal is coming back to religion. Iqbal talks about Quran. For example, in his first lecture, very beginning, he says, Quran is a book of deeds, amal, and rather than of ideas. So he's not just talking about ideas and ilm, he's also talking about amal, which, later on his Mad Moment, the concept of this insani kamal, sort of idealizes. He is very much a proponent of science. He doesn't consider science and religion to be poles apart. And he feels that science actually is in the very spirit of Islam, the spirit of inquiry, the spirit of understanding our environment, the spirit of creativity that Islam highlighted from the day one. So science, Quran, these are the areas where, he feels that we could reconstruct Muslim philosophy in the larger benefit of the Muslims, because he was deeply worried that on the one hand, Muslims were very much depressed. Number 2, they were disorganized. And number 3, they had serious reservations about Jadidiyat. And Jadidiyat was the only way forward. And they didn't have to accept Jadidiyat by surrendering their Muslimness. So in his poetry, in his lifestyles, in his letters, and of course in his lectures, Iqbal personified that synthesis between Western modernity and his own Islamic and South Asian traditions. Iqbal also found faults with materialism of the modern West in some cases. Iqbal found faults even with classical Greek philosophy, which had inspired Farabi, which had inspired Al-Biruni, which had inspired more than anywhere else, Ibn Sina. And he thought that Socrates only concentrated on human beings, ignored the environment, ignored animals, ignored plants. And what else we see in the environment? This was Iqbal's unease with Socrates. With Plato, on the one hand, Plato was a great teacher, a great philosopher, great contribution that these philosophers had made into the evolution of early Islamic philosophy. But at the same time, Iqbal feels that Plato, he didn't feel comfortable with sense perception, senses. There's too much emphasis on reason, too much emphasis on logic. But what about human feelings? What about human sentiments? And what about mushahida? What about senses? So Iqbal could go to the extent of challenging even the Greek masters, the way he challenged some of the philosophers in Europe. Iqbal, on the one hand, in his political philosophy, very quickly, because I'm worried about the time factor, on the one hand, Iqbal wants liberation, independence, azadi. He wants to decolonize these societies. He's against racism, he's against colonialism. But he wants to go beyond that. That sovereignty should be reflected in the life and in the thoughts of these people. So he does not teach hatred against the West, because he feels that Western civilization is part of a human civilization, the way Islamic civilization is part of human civilization. Islamic civilization has fed into the Western civilization, and now Western civilization can inspire Muslims. So Iqbal is not into clash of civilization. Iqbal is asking Muslims to learn more about this Western civilization and pick up some of those positive attributes in science, in philosophy, rational approach, activity, innovation, creativity, and most of all, independence and respect for human life. And when he talks about khudi as an individual self-consciousness or as a collective self-consciousness, I think that is where he's talking about liberation. He is aware of stagnation that the Muslims have been facing. He's not living in a kind of fool's paradise by saying that everything is perfect with us. He's saying, look, for the last 500-600 years, we have been left behind in our scientific knowledge, in our innovations, in all different areas. And I think this was a big question in the 19th century. And even now, as a historian, I tell you, we still wonder why these huge empires, the Ottomans, the Mughals, the Safis, and the Mims in China, or the Malis in Africa, why were they defeated on their homeland by a few people coming from thousands of miles away? And people talk about lack of technological knowledge, lack of institutional framework, lack of professional armies, lack of navy, and most of all, lack of knowledge capital. The universities in the West, this university here in Oxford, Cambridge, or all across Europe, had brought about that knowledge capital which regenerated the West. It came out of the medieval period and became the power engine of modernity. And that is what Iqbal wanted us to learn about, rather than disliking it, suspecting it. So he was critical, but then he is also fond of those Qalandars and Sufis and Mardi Moments. So he's not derooting us from our own traditions, but he feels that we got to move on. And if Western civilization is a challenge, it is also a God-sent opportunity that we should accept and move forward. I think Iqbal is the first person amongst Muslim intellectuals who uses the word civil society, because his concept of Muslim communities is not just the government, not just the state, not the so-called powerful men at the top. It means people, thinking people, people who will restrain authoritarianism of the state, people who will create bridges across ethnicities, across national boundaries, across denominational diversities, the problems that we face today, especially in the Muslim world. Acceptance of pluralities, religious pluralities, doctrinal pluralities, ethnic pluralities. Every Muslim state is bedeviled by these diversities. And the leaders think that they are threats, rather than accepting plurality as a very natural thing and how to handle it in a logical way, in a rational way, and by building bridges. This is what Iqbal meant by civil society. And so this is where modern knowledge, I think, is very important. He's challenging the very narrowly defined concept of Islam, which is based on rituals, hakukullah, which ignores hakukul ibad, where the concept of Jannat and Jahannam have been reduced to fantasies. He goes beyond that, and he thinks Islam is richer than that. And Islam is endowed with several spiritual answers to some of these serious questions. And this is with the Prophet's life remains so relevant to Iqbal. So on the one hand, you have philosophers who are Iqbal's tutors and guides, but then there is another tutor, a spiritual tutor, that is the Prophet. And all those other scholars and Sufis who over the centuries illuminated, Muslim history and Muslim. And this is where I think Iqbal knows that it's not an easy job. They're saying, oh, we should pick up things from the West, their scientific knowledge, their literary contributions, their philosophical ideas, their political institutions, even after we have become independent, which is very, very important for Iqbal, azadi, independence, sovereignty. But he wants something which has not been done over the last 600-700 years. And this is called ijtihad. I think he is one of those very few philosophers over the last few centuries who said Islam's regeneration, or Muslims' new beginning, new tomorrow, renaissance, nishat-e-saniya, will come about with ijtihad, this exercise of where we are, what went wrong, how do we accept the challenges and opportunities of modern living. And I think we people in diaspora are facing those challenges the way Muslim communities or post-colonial societies face these issues back home. Iqbal thought and believed that ijtihad is the way forward, innovation. Now here, Mullah Maududi and some scholars differ with Iqbal, like Maududi and Sayyid Qutb thought that only a small community of religious scholars would be able to do ijtihad because the rest of the people are masses and uneducated. No, I think Iqbal goes beyond that. And this is where Professor Dr. Fazlur Rahman, sadly banished from Pakistan, who ended up in Chicago, views Iqbal more than a rebel rouser. Iqbal's ideas on education, Iqbal's ideas on ijtihad, Iqbal's ideas on nishat-e-saniya, Iqbal's ideas on relating with the West/modernity. So I think we need to go back to people like Dr. Fazlur Rahman. We need to go back to Muhammad Iqbal by reading his lectures. And we need to go back to the commentaries which are produced on Iqbal. I mean, 2 years ago, a chap, a Sirdarji, a young man from Hong Kong or Singapore, did his PhD on Muhammad Iqbal here in Oxford. Savior Singh, Iqbal Savior Singh, his grandfather was fond of Allama Iqbal, Sirdarji, pre-partition days. He named his grandson as Iqbal. And then this guy grows up in Singapore or Hong Kong, and he comes to Oxford to do his DPhil, and he writes his thesis on Allama Iqbal. And I read it. Yeah. At the very beginning, in dedication, he says, I'm dedicating this thesis, my PhD, to my late grandfather, who wanted me to become a student and a scholar of Muhammad Iqbal. So Iqbal goes beyond those confined, religiously confined or defined boundaries. And this thesis has been published by Cambridge University Press. Javed Majid has done excellent work on Allama Iqbal, and lectures of Allama Iqbal, including the one he gave on ijtihad here in London when he came to visit during the Roundtable Conference, is included in that collection, which was published by Stanford University Press and Iqbal Academy in Lahore. So there is quite a bit of work. More recently, I read an MA thesis from McGill University, Canada, on Shariati's view of Insani Kamil, where Iqbal is the teacher. The way Iqbal took Rumi as a tutor, Ustad, same way Shariati took Muhammad Iqbal as his tutor. And not only as a tutor, as an academic tutor, but also as a personification of that Insani Kamil. So there is quite a bit of research. I know there are people who have their criticism of Allama Iqbal. Some people will say, oh, well, he didn't write anything in Punjabi. Some people say, why did he accept knighthood? I think these are minor issues. Iqbal never claimed to be all perfect. Iqbal raised issues, which the philosophers do. Iqbal played with ideas and words. He was a wordsmith, and that is why he created such a beautiful poetry. That when I went to Iran and, I mentioned Iqbal and some of his poems, and the people would be fascinated because of his language. They could not believe that a Hindi Musalman could produce and write such an impressive poetry. Same way in Central Asia, in Bosnia, there is an Iqbal Chair. There are students of Iqbal's philosophy in Bosnia. So we need to, if we can't read his Persian poetry, Pyam-e Mashriq, which is philosophy, Goethe, and his Javed Nama is, of course, about Javed, Iqbal Marhum, but it's basically about Rumi as well. And then, of course, his Urdu poetry. I think it's very inspiring. His personal life, I mean, I can go on and on. I recently read a short book by Doris, who was appointed by Allama Iqbal as a governess for his children, Javed and Nasra in Lahore in the 1930s. And she was a German. And how she saw Iqbal from so close quarters. Iqbal as a human being. Iqbal as a down-to-earth person. Iqbal with his alert mind and ailing body. Iqbal who had friends, Hindu friends, Sikh friends, Christian friends, Muslim friends, and with his great sense of humanity and humor in Doris's book. And I'm sure there are quite a few books in Urdu and many other languages. But I think Iqbal, for us who are living in diaspora, means a lot. He connects East and the West. And we people are the bridgeheads between the East and the West. While we can introduce, and we are, introducing the heritage of spread over centuries from non-Western world into the Western world, through our work, through our personal associations, through our academic and social and economic contributions. At the same time, our learning, our immersion in Western societies and Western legal, educational, cultural, industrial, scientific achievements, and then transferring some of this heritage to the places that we come from. I think this is where I think Iqbal is a role model for us and for future generations who want to make a difference in their lives and also in the lives of people, especially in the post-colonial world. Thank you very much. Shukriya. Khuda Hafiz.